Let the class begin. Welcome to the part 2 of print culture and the modern world. In today's class, we are going to continue where we have left it. So we'll begin with the next topic, that is the new reading mania. Now, through the 17th and the 18th centuries, literacy rate went up. I told you in the last class that the demand for the books was huge, and from oral culture it became a reading culture. To make the people literate, they had to set up schools. So the literacy rates went up. That's the first point. The churches of different denominations, big church or a small church, started schools in villages carrying literacy to peasants and artisans. By the end of the 18th century, in some parts of Europe, literacy rates were as high as 60 to 80%. As literacy in schools spread in European countries, there was virtual reading mania as they became literate. People wanted books to read and printers produced increasing in ever increasing numbers. Now comes, which are the forms of books printed? Now this question is also very important for 5 marks. Now, new forms of popular literature appeared in print targeting new audience. Booksellers employed peddlers. Peddlers are the people who go around the villages carrying little books for sale. There were almanacs. Almanacs or ritual calendars along with ballads and folk tales. This is probably the first one. But other forms of reading also matter largely for entertainment began to reach ordinary readers as well. In England, penny chapbooks were carried by petty peddlers known as chapmen who sold them for a penny so that even the poor could buy them. Remember this for MCQ. Next, in France, there was a book called Bibliothèque Bleue, which were low-priced small books printed on poor quality paper and bound in cheap blue covers. Then there were the romances printed on 4 to 6 pages and more substantial histories, which were stories about the past, and books were of various sizes, serving many different purposes and interests. The periodical press, developed from the early 18th century, combined information about current affairs and entertainment. Newspapers and journals carried information about wars and trade, as well as news of development in some other places. Similarly, the ideas of scientists and philosophers now became accessible as they started printing. Ancient and medieval scientific texts were compiled and published with the maps and scientific diagrams, which was now accessible to the common public. When scientists like Isaac Newton began to publish their discoveries, they could influence a much wider circle of scientifically minded readers. The writings of thinkers such as Thomas Paine, Voltaire, Jean-Jacques Rousseau were also widely printed and read. Thus, the ideas about science, reason, rationality find their way into popular literature. These are the forms of book or the kinds of books that got printed. Tremble, therefore, tyrants of the world. By the mid 18th century, there was a common conviction that books were the means of spreading progress and enlightenment, right? Because the books were written by the Enlightenment thinkers as well. Many believed that books could change the world, liberate society from despotism and tyranny. And there is a time when the church and the monarchy were actually discriminating people. But in that time, Louis Sebastian Mercier, a novelist in 18th century France, declared the printing press as the most powerful engine of progress, and the public opinion is the force that will sweep despotism away. In his novels, the heroes are transformed by acts of reading. They devour books, are lost in the world books create, and become enlightened in the process. This was to show that books could change the world. Convinced of the power of print in bringing enlightenment and destroying the basis of despotism, Mercier proclaimed, "Tremble, therefore, tyrants of the world," before the virtual writer. Print culture and the impact on French Revolution. Remember, the Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire, Montesquieu, Rousseau are from French Revolution. Print popularized the ideas of Enlightenment thinkers. Collectively, their writings provided a critical commentary on tradition, superstition, and despotism. Books written by Rousseau, Social Contract, Montesquieu, and Voltaire. These books gave the common people ideas about newfound liberalism. They argued for the rule of reason rather than custom and demanded that everything be judged through application of reason, not uh, custom, reason and rationality as opposed to custom. They attacked the sacred authority of the church and the despotic power of the state, making the legitimacy, questioning the legitimacy of the social order based on tradition. The writings of Voltaire, Rousseau were read widely, and those who read those books saw the world through their new eyes, the eyes that were questioning, critical, and rational. This is the first impact on French Revolution. The second one is the print created a new culture of dialogue and debate where all values, norms, institutions were re-evaluated and they were questioned, they were discussed by public that had become aware of the power of reason and recognized the need to question existing ideas and beliefs. Within this public culture, new ideas of social revolution came into being. Third one, by the 1780, there was an outpouring of literature that mocked the royalty and criticized their morality. In the process, they started to question the existing social order. Cartoons and caricatures were made to make sure that the monarchy uh, notices it. Normally, monarchy remained absorbed only in sensual pleasures, while the common people suffered the immense hardship. Remember the bread issue, right? Now, the cartoons and the caricatures were made to mock the royalty. This literature circulated underground and led to the growth of hostile sentiments against the monarchy. Now, how do we look at these arguments? There can be no doubt that print helps the spread of ideas, but we must remember that people did not read just one kind of literature. If there is positive, there is negative also. If they read the ideas of Voltaire and Rousseau, they were also exposed to monarchical and church propaganda too. They were not influenced directly by everything they read or saw. They accepted some ideas and rejected others. So, they interpreted things their own way. Print did not directly shape their minds, but it opened up the possibility of thinking differently. Now, what are the impacts of print on children, women, and workers? Now, as primary education became compulsory from the late 19th century, children also became an important category of readers. Production of school textbooks became critical for the publishing industry as children's press devoted to literature for children alone was set up in France in 1857. This press published new works as well as old fairy tales because it was for children. The Grimm brothers in Germany spent years compiling traditional folk tales gathered from peasants called Grimm tales. What they collected was edited before the stories were published in a collection in 1812. Anything that was considered unsuitable or would appear vulgar to the elites was not included in the published version, right? Rural folk tales thus acquired a new form in the printed form. In this way, print recorded old tales but also changed them. Women became important readers as well as writers. We will see penny magazines were especially meant for women, as were manuals teaching proper behavior, housekeeping. Remember, in China, in Japan, this used to happen. When novels began to be written in the 19th century, women were seen as important readers. Novels were written for women, novels written by women too. Some of the best known novelists during that time were Jane Austen, the Bronte sisters, George Eliot. Their writings became important in defining a new type of a woman, the woman with will, strength of personality, determination, and the power to think. Now, because the books were available, lending libraries had been in existence from 17th century to the 19th century as well. lending libraries in England became instruments of educating white-collar workers, artisans, and lower middle-class people. They were all, the lending libraries were there in the factories as well. Sometimes self-educated working class wrote for themselves. After the working day was gradually shortened from the mid-19th century, they had time for some self-improvement and self-expression. They wrote political tracts and autobiographies in large numbers. Now, the print from the modern printing press that Gutenberg invented took more improvements. By the late 18th century, the press came to be made out of metal. Through the 19th century, there were series of further innovations in printing technology. By the mid-19th century, Richard M. Hoe of New York had perfected the power-driven cylindrical press. Now, the new modern printing press was capable of printing 8,000 sheets per hour, and this was particularly useful for printing newspapers. In the late 19th century, the offset press was developed, which could print up to 6 colors at a time. From the turn of 20th century, electrically operated presses accelerated the printing operations. A series of other developments also followed. Methods of feeding paper improved, the quality of plates become better. Automatic paper reels and photoelectric control of the color register were introduced. The accumulation of several individual mechanical improvements transformed the appearance of printed text into a better one. Printers and publishers continuously developed new strategies to sell their product. 19th century periodicals serialized important novels, which gave birth to a particular way of writing novels, the serialized version of novels, part 1, part 2, like that. In the 1920s in England, popular works were sold in cheap series called the shilling series. Remember, for MCQ, the shilling series, like the penny chapbooks. The dust cover of the book is also a 20th century innovation. Within the onset of the Great Depression in the 1930s, publishers feared a decline in book purchases. To sustain buying, they brought out a cheap paperback editions as well, because of the time of depression. Now, this is the new power driven cylindrical press that we talked about. Now, the manuscripts before the age of print. Now, the print comes to India. India had a very rich and old tradition of handwritten manuscripts in Sanskrit, Arabic, Persian, as well as in various vernacular languages. We used to have manuscripts written. They were copied on palm leaves or handmade paper, normally on palm leaves. Pages were sometimes beautifully illustrated. They would be either pressed between wooden covers or sewn together to ensure preservation. Manuscripts continued to be produced well after the introduction of print down to the late 19th century. Manuscripts were highly expensive and fragile. You know the limitations of the manuscripts. They are awkward to handle, they're fragile, expensive too. They had to be handled carefully, and they could not be read easily as the script was written in different styles. So manuscripts were not widely used in everyday life. Even though the pre-colonial Bengal had developed an extensive network of village primary school, students did not read the text. They only learned to write. The condition of education was also like that, that teachers dictated portions of text from memory and students would write them down. Many thus became literate without ever actually reading any kinds of text. Now, this is the text that you are seeing. This is obviously the manuscript pages from the Rig Veda. Now, the printing press, first printing press came to Goa with Portuguese missionaries in the mid 16th century. Now, the Jesuit priest learnt Konkani and printed several tracts. By 1674, about 50 books had been printed in Konkani and Kannada languages. Catholic priest printed the first Tamil book in 1579 at Cochin, and in 1713 the first Malayalam book was printed. By 1710, Dutch Protestant missionaries had printed 32 Tamil texts. Many of them were the translation of the older works. The English language press did not grow in India till quite late, even though English East India Company began to import presses from the late 17th century. Now, print comes to India. What happens? The major development in the print. From 1780, James Augustus Hickey began to edit the Bengal Gazette. That's the first magazine or the newspaper that we saw. a weekly magazine that described itself as a commercial paper open to all but influenced by none. So it was private English enterprise proud of its independence from colonial influence that began English printing in India. Hickey, James Augustus Hickey, published a lot of advertisements, including those that related to import of sale of slaves. He condemned that one. He also published a lot of gossip about company senior officials of East India Company. Enraged by this, Governor General Warren Hastings persecuted Hickey and encouraged the publication of officially sanctioned newspapers that could counter the flow of information that damaged the image of colonial government. So, in simple terms, we can just say that they needed the newspapers which would not criticize the government. Journals appeared in print. There were Indians too who began to publish Indian newspapers. The first to appear was the weekly Bengal Gazette, brought out by Gangadhar Bhattacharya, who was close to Ram Mohan Roy. Now, this is a picture of Bengal Gazette. Now that brings to the end of part 2. Guys, I hope you have learned about part 2. I'll just summarize part 2. The part 2, you have to focus on the impact of print, how there were new forms of printing, impact of print on French Revolution, and the impact of print on women, workers, and children. Later, print comes to India. How was the print in India? It started with manuscripts. Later, we began with the Bengal Gazette, and Gangadhar Bhattacharya was the first one to edit the Bengal Gazette. In the next video, we are going to learn about the impact of print on religious reforms, women, workers in India, and how did British government respond to the print in India. So thank you for watching and have a lovely day.